Wyoming Territory, 1877. The wagon wheels creaked against the uneven trail, each jolt a reminder of how far Abigail Morgan had traveled from everything familiar. The vast Wyoming landscape stretched before her, painted in muted golds and browns, beneath a sky so wide and deep it seemed to swallow the earth. Abigail adjusted her bonnet against the afternoon sun, her fingers lingering on the worn fabric, a gift from her mother before illness had claimed her strength. The frontier wind carried whispers of sage and pine so different from the antiseptic and gunpowder scents that had filled her nostrils during the war. Sometimes in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, Abigail could still hear the moans of wounded soldiers, could still feel blood seeping through bandages as she worked frantically to stem the tide of death. But today the memories seemed more distant, carried away by the Wyoming breeze. "Whoa there," she called softly to her mare, pulling the reins as she spotted a small cluster of wagons off the main trail. Something was amiss. A man pacing anxiously outside while muffled cries came from within the lead wagon. Instinct took over, the nurse in her responding before conscious thought. Abigail secured her horse and approached medical bag in hand, a habit she couldn't break even years after the war. The man's face brightened with desperate hope when he spotted her. "Please, miss, my wife. The baby's coming, but something's wrong. She's been laboring since dawn." Inside the wagon, Abigail found a young woman drenched in sweat, her face contorted in pain beyond exhaustion. One touch to the swollen belly told Abigail what she needed to know. The baby was turned wrong. "I'm a nurse," she said, voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "I've delivered babies before. Will you allow me to help?" Hours passed in that cramped wagon as Abigail worked to save mother and child. Her hands remembered what to do even as her mind flashed to field hospitals, where she'd assisted in far worse conditions. With gentle but firm movements, she turned the baby coaching the exhausted mother through waves of pain. "One more push," Abigail encouraged, her sleeves rolled up and hair falling loose from its pins. "Your child is almost here." When the infant's first cry pierced the air, Abigail felt the familiar rush that had kept her going through the darkest days of war, the miracle of life persisting against all odds. She cleaned the squalling baby girl, wrapped her in clean linen, and placed her in her mother's trembling arms. "You have a gift," the father said, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. "God sent you to us today." Abigail simply smiled, exhaustion settling into her bones as she packed her supplies. "I'm glad I was passing by. Take care of them both." The family offered her food and rest, but Thornfield Ranch awaited, and she was already behind schedule. Back on the trail, twilight painted the distant mountains in purple shadows. The temperature dropped quickly with the sun, and Abigail pulled her cloak tighter. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, Clara, whose heart condition had worsened over the winter, making it impossible for her to continue as cook at Thornfield Ranch. "I'll be fine, Abigail," Clara had insisted, pressing the letter of introduction into her daughter's hand. "The position pays well, and Dr. Thornfield is fair if somewhat reserved. The medicine is expensive, and we need the income." The mention of Dr. Thornfield had piqued Abigail's curiosity, but her mother had been vague about the ranch's owner, saying only that he valued privacy and competence above all else. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Abigail crested a hill and saw Thornfield Ranch spread before her. Larger than she'd imagined, a sprawling collection of buildings with a two-story main house commanding the center. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark white for a heartbeat before darkness reclaimed it. "Just a little farther," she murmured to her tired mare as fat raindrops began to fall. As she approached, something caught her attention, an unnatural orange glow flickering in one of the downstairs windows. Not lamplight, too wild, too bright. Fire. Abigail's heart quickened. She dismounted at the hitching post, securing her horse with practiced hands before racing toward the back entrance. The smell of smoke grew stronger as she pounded on the kitchen door. When no one answered, she tried the handle and found it unlocked. Smoke billowed through the kitchen flames, licking up the wall where lightning had apparently struck. A pot of stew simmered, forgotten on the stove. Without hesitation, Abigail grabbed a bucket of washing water and hurled it at the base of the flames. She seized a heavy wool blanket, beating at the remaining fire as smoke stung her eyes and scorched her lungs. Outside, the storm intensified, rain hammering against the roof as Abigail fought the growing blaze. Her arms ached as she continued to beat at the fire, unaware of the kitchen door slamming open behind her until a shadow loomed and strong hands pulled her backward. "Move aside," commanded a deep voice as a tall figure brushed past her carrying a large metal wash basin filled with water. The man doused the remaining flames with practiced efficiency, then turned to assess the damage, his breathing heavy but controlled. Only when he seemed satisfied that the danger had passed did he finally face her. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Abigail straightened her spine, pushing strands of damp hair from her face as she took in the man before her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His face might have been handsome once before time, and hardship had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, piercing blue even in the dim light, studied her with suspicion. "I'm Abigail Morgan," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Clara Morgan's daughter. I've come to replace her as cook." Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by confusion. "Clara's daughter," he repeated. "What are you doing here at this hour in this weather?" "I would have arrived earlier, but I stopped to help a woman in labor," Abigail explained, gesturing to the half-prepared meal abandoned on the counter. "My mother's heart condition has worsened. She can no longer make the journey. I've come to take her place," the man doctor. Nathaniel Thornfield, she presumed, looked her up and down, taking in her travel-worn appearance and the soot now smudging her face and hands. "You arrive unannounced in the middle of a storm break into my home and expect to be hired." His voice held disbelief rather than anger. "I didn't break in," Abigail countered. "The door was unlocked and your kitchen was on fire." She gestured to the scorched wall. "You're welcome, by the way." For a moment, a surprise registered on his face, as if he wasn't accustomed to being challenged. Then unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. "Nathaniel Thornfield," he confirmed with a curt nod. "And I didn't ask for your help." "Fortunate that you received it anyway," Abigail replied, reaching for a cloth to wipe the soot from her hands. "My mother sent a letter last week explaining the situation." "I received no letter," Nathaniel said flatly. "The post is unreliable during spring storms," Abigail acknowledged. "But I'm here now and you need a cook." Thunder rumbled overhead, punctuating her statement. Rain continued to pour outside, streaming down the windows in rivulets. Nathaniel looked at the half-prepared meal, the scorched wall, and finally back at the determined woman standing in his kitchen. "1 week," he said at last, his voice cool and measured. "You have 1 week to prove yourself." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And if you fail to meet my standards, not only will you lose this position, but I'll discontinue the medical stipend for your mother." The threat hung in the air between them. Abigail felt her throat tighten at the mention of her mother's medicine. Clara hadn't told her about any stipend. Was this why she'd been so insistent that Abigail take this position? "That's all I need," she replied with more confidence than she felt, refusing to show how his words had affected her. Nathaniel moved toward the door, then paused. "The bunkhouse is full, but there's a small room off the kitchen. It was meant for the cook. Your mother never used it. Preferred to ride back to town." "Yes, thank you," Abigail replied. "I'll finish preparing tonight's meal." He gave a brief nod and turned to leave, then stopped again. "Why did you really come, Miss Morgan? Surely a young woman with nursing experience has better prospects than cooking for ranch hands in the middle of nowhere." The question caught her off guard. She considered deflecting, but something in his searching gaze made her answer honestly. "Some places feel safer when you've seen what I've seen," she said quietly. "And cooking helps." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or understanding, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Without another word, he left, closing the door firmly behind him. Abigail released a long, shaky breath, only now allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. She surveyed the damage to the kitchen, noting with relief that it was primarily cosmetic. The wall would need repairs, but the stove was undamaged and the food salvageable. She removed her damp cloak and rolled up her sleeves. There was work to be done. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows as Abigail kneaded dough with practiced movements. She had slept little, too aware of her precarious position and the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch around her. Instead, she had risen before first light to begin preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. The small room adjacent to the kitchen had been dusty but serviceable, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. She had found clean linens in a cupboard and made the space her own as best she could in the dark hours of the night. Now, as morning light filled the kitchen, she worked with quiet determination. Coffee brewed its rich aroma filling the air as she shaped biscuits and laid them on a baking sheet. A pot of beef stew simmered on the back of the stove, her mother's recipe with wild onions and herbs she had brought in her saddlebags. It was a hearty breakfast meant to fortify men who would work from sunrise to sunset. As she worked, Abigail allowed her mind to wander back to the years that had brought her here. The war had taken her father when she was just 16, leaving her and her mother to manage alone. Determined to make a difference, she had trained as a nurse serving in field hospitals, where she had seen more death and suffering than any young woman should. It was there she had met Richard, a kind-eyed lieutenant who had promised her a future once the fighting ended. But Richard, like so many others, had never returned from the battlefield. Abigail had come home to her mother carrying grief and nightmares alongside her medical knowledge. Cooking had become her solace, the one activity that could quiet her mind and soothe her spirit. Creating nourishment from simple ingredients felt like a small victory against the chaos and destruction she had witnessed. The sound of boots on the porch steps pulled her from her memories. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron as the door opened, revealing Nathaniel Thornfield. He paused in the doorway, seemingly surprised to find the kitchen already alive with activity. "Good morning, Dr. Thornfield." Abigail greeted him with more confidence than she felt. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the coffee pot, the biscuits ready for baking, and the simmering stew. "You're up early," he observed. "There's much to be done," she replied simply. He nodded, moving to pour himself a cup of coffee. Steam rose from the dark liquid as he took a cautious sip. If he was impressed by the quality, he gave no indication. "The men will be in shortly," he said. "Usually 8 for breakfast, though sometimes riders from neighboring ranches join if they're passing through." "I've made plenty," Abigail assured him. Nathaniel lingered by the counter watching as she slid the biscuits into the oven. There was something in his gaze that made her wonder what he was really seeing, her or perhaps some ghost from his past. The silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken questions. "You mentioned you've seen things," he finally said. "You were a nurse?" Abigail nodded, surprised he had remembered her vague comment from the night before. "During the war, field hospitals mostly." "Army Medical Corps," he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," she confirmed, giving him a curious look. "Fifth Cavalry," he said shortly, cutting off further inquiry. He set down his coffee cup with finality. "I'll send the men in when they're ready." With that, he was gone, leaving Abigail to wonder about the man who had once been a military doctor, but now lived as a reclusive rancher in the Wyoming Territory. The revelation added another layer to the mystery of Nathaniel Thornfield, and she found herself unexpectedly curious about what had led him from battlefield medicine to this remote existence. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of the ranch hands, a group of weathered men who entered the kitchen with wary curiosity. They introduced themselves one by one: Joseph the foreman, Old Fletcher, who had apparently been with the ranch since its founding, Miguel and his son Carlos the Johnson brothers, Frank and Daniel, and a young man barely out of his teens, whom everyone simply called Kid. They were polite but reserved, clearly uncertain about this unexpected replacement for Clara Morgan. Abigail served them efficiently, placing steaming bowls of stew and fresh biscuits before each man. She noticed Nathaniel taking a seat at the head of the table, slightly removed from the others. Conversation halted as the men tasted her cooking. Abigail held her breath, aware that her future at Thornfield Ranch hung in the balance of this first meal. Old Fletcher was the first to respond, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "This tastes just like your ma's," he declared, reaching for a second biscuit. "Got the same touch with herbs as she does." The tension in the room eased as the other men nodded their agreement, tucking into their food with renewed enthusiasm. Only Nathaniel remained silent, eating methodically while observing the interactions around him. When he finally spoke, the room quieted instantly. "The north pasture fence needs mending after last night's storm," he said to Joseph. "Take Frank and Daniel with you. Miguel, check on the mares in the east barn. That lightning spooked them badly." The men nodded, finishing their breakfast as Nathaniel continued assigning the day's tasks. Abigail moved quietly around the kitchen, refilling coffee cups and offering seconds to those who wanted them. She was keenly aware of Nathaniel watching her movements, assessing her efficiency and demeanor. When the men had filed out to begin their work, Nathaniel remained his half-empty coffee cup before him. Abigail busied herself clearing the table, uncertain what to expect. "The stew," he said finally. "What's in it?" "Beef, wild onions, carrots from my mother's garden," she replied, stacking plates. "Thyme, rosemary, a pinch of sage. My mother's recipe, though, I add a bit more pepper than she does." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "It reminded me of something from before." Before he could elaborate, the sound of an approaching wagon drew his attention to the window. His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "My brother Samuel," he explained, rising from his seat, "earlier than expected." Abigail followed his gaze to see a well-appointed wagon pulling up to the main house. A man who bore a striking resemblance to Nathaniel, though younger and more formally dressed, jumped down from the driver's seat before helping a young woman descend. "He's bringing his wife to see the ranch," Nathaniel continued, his tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting them until next week." "Should I prepare something special for lunch?" Abigail asked. Nathaniel seemed to consider this for a moment. "No," he decided. "They'll eat what we eat." He hesitated. "Perhaps dinner could be something more appropriate for a lady's first visit." Abigail nodded, understanding the unspoken request. "I'll make something suitable." Nathaniel moved toward the door, then paused. "You didn't ask if you could stay," he said, his back still to her. "Have I earned my week?" "You've earned breakfast," he conceded. "Lunch and dinner will determine the rest." With that cryptic statement, he left to greet his brother and sister-in-law, leaving Abigail to wonder if she had imagined the brief softening in his expression when he tasted her stew. As Abigail prepared lunch, a hearty chicken and vegetable soup with fresh bread, she caught glimpses of Nathaniel showing his brother and sister-in-law around the ranch. Samuel Thornfield was more animated than his older brother, gesturing enthusiastically as they walked between buildings. His wife, Catherine, was a slender young woman with honey-colored hair, dressed in a traveling suit that spoke of Eastern wealth and fashion. The morning passed quickly as Abigail settled into the rhythm of the kitchen. She found most of what she needed, though some staples were running low, and made mental notes of supplies to request. As she worked, she explored the kitchen more thoroughly, familiarizing herself with its layout and contents. In one drawer, partially stuck beneath a stack of kitchen linens, she discovered a folded piece of paper. Curiosity getting the better of her, she carefully extracted it, finding a letter written in a delicate, feminine hand. It was addressed simply to "My dearest Nathaniel" and signed "Forever yours, Lydia." The contents were mostly obscured where the paper had been folded and refolded countless times, but one line stood out clearly. "Sophia laughed today for the first time, a sound more precious than any music." Abigail carefully refolded the letter and returned it to its hiding place, a strange heaviness settling in her chest. Lydia must have been Nathaniel's wife, and Sophia their child. Yet neither was present at the ranch, and Nathaniel wore the unmistakable mantle of a man who had suffered profound loss. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the ranch hands for lunch. They seemed more at ease with her presence now, offering small smiles and murmured thanks as she served them. Samuel, Catherine, and Nathaniel joined them, taking seats at the far end of the table. "So, you're Clara Morgan's daughter," Samuel said warmly when introductions were made. "Your mother is an excellent cook. We were sorry to hear of her illness." "Thank you," Abigail replied. "She's improving with rest, but her heart won't allow her to continue working." "And you've stepped in admirably," Catherine added, tasting the soup with appreciation. "This is wonderful." Nathaniel remained quiet, though Abigail noticed him watching the exchange with a guarded expression. The meal continued, with Samuel dominating the conversation, sharing news from the East and asking questions about the ranch's operations. There was an underlying tension between the brothers that manifested in Nathaniel's clipped responses and Samuel's too bright smile. After lunch, as Abigail cleared the dishes, she overheard fragments of conversation from the porch where Nathaniel and Samuel had stepped outside to talk privately. "Wasting your talents out here," Samuel was saying, his voice carrying through the partially open window. "The railroad company's offer is more than fair." "We've discussed this," Nathaniel replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The ranch is not for sale, not in whole or in part." "Be reasonable, Nathaniel. The northern portion is barely used and the money would allow you to modernize the rest. Think of the future." "I am thinking of the future," Nathaniel countered. "This land has been in our family for generations. I won't be the one to parcel it off for railroad tracks and way stations." Their voices faded as they moved farther from the house, but Abigail had heard enough to understand the source of tension. Samuel wanted Nathaniel to sell land to the railroad, a common enough scenario throughout the West as the country expanded and connected its distant territories. Catherine remained in the kitchen offering to help with the dishes. Abigail accepted gratefully, finding the younger woman pleasant company as they worked side by side. "I hope you'll forgive my husband's enthusiasm," Catherine said after a while. "Samuel has grand visions for modernizing the ranch, but he doesn't understand Nathaniel's attachment to keeping things as they are." "It seems a common conflict between brothers," Abigail observed diplomatically. Catherine smiled. "Indeed, though I suspect there's more to it than simply different visions for the future." She hesitated, then added, "Samuel worries about Nathaniel being alone out here, especially after everything that happened." Abigail kept her expression neutral, though her curiosity was piqued. "It must be difficult being so isolated," she offered, hoping Catherine might elaborate. "Yes, especially since—" Catherine stopped abruptly as the kitchen door opened, admitting the brothers back into the house. The tension between them was palpable, though both maintained polite expressions. "Catherine, we should rest before dinner," Samuel suggested, offering his arm to his wife. The journey was tiring. Catherine nodded, drying her hands on a nearby towel. "Thank you for the delicious lunch, Miss Morgan. I look forward to dinner." As they left, Nathaniel lingered in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. Abigail continued her work, giving him the space to speak if he chose to. "My brother thinks progress is inevitable," he said finally, "that old ways must give way to new." "And you disagree," Abigail prompted when he fell silent. "I think some things are worth preserving," he replied, his gaze drifting to the window, where the vast expanse of his ranch stretched toward the horizon, "even if the rest of the world has decided they're obsolete." The weight behind his words suggested he was speaking of more than just land. Before Abigail could respond, he continued, "For dinner, my sister-in-law is partial to roast chicken if we have it." "We do," Abigail confirmed, "with potatoes, spring vegetables, and apple pie for dessert." Nathaniel nodded, the ghost of approval flickering across his features. "That would be suitable." He turned to leave, but paused once more. "You've handled the kitchen well today, Miss Morgan. Better than I expected." The admission seemed to cost him something, as if compliments were a currency he rarely spent. Without waiting for her response, he left, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Abigail allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. It wasn't outright confirmation that she could stay, but it was progress. She returned to her preparations, determined that dinner would secure her position at Thornfield Ranch. The afternoon slipped away as Abigail devoted herself to preparing a dinner that would impress even Eastern sensibilities. She roasted 2 plump chickens with herbs and lemon-prepared potatoes with butter and parsley, and simmered spring vegetables to tender perfection. The apple pie, her specialty, cooled on the windowsill, its crust golden and fragrant. As she worked, she continued exploring the kitchen and its immediate surroundings. In the garden behind the house, she discovered a small plot overgrown with weeds, but still showing signs of once careful cultivation. Herbs struggled among the wild grasses, thyme, mint, and what appeared to be lavender. Impulsively, Abigail knelt and began clearing weeds from around the surviving plants. The soil was good, rich, with promise despite years of neglect. With some attention, the garden could thrive again, providing fresh herbs and vegetables for the kitchen. She made a mental note to ask Nathaniel's permission to restore it. As she worked, her gaze was drawn to a more distant corner of the property where a small fenced area stood beneath a solitary oak tree. It seemed out of place, too small for livestock, too far from the house for a kitchen garden. Curious, Abigail brushed dirt from her hands and walked toward it. The small enclosure contained a single grave marker, simple but well-crafted from polished wood. Carved into its surface was a name and dates that made Abigail's heart constrict. Sophia Thornfield, 1872-1872. A baby then. Nathaniel's child had lived less than a year. Abigail stood in respectful silence, understanding now some of the sadness that seemed to permeate the ranch. She wondered about Lydia, Nathaniel's wife, whose letter she had found. Was she buried elsewhere, or had she left after the devastating loss of their child? "You shouldn't be here." The voice startled her. Nathaniel stood a few yards away, his expression dark, with barely contained anger. Abigail straightened instinctively, stepping back from the grave. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was clearing weeds from the garden and noticed this place." "This is private," Nathaniel said, his voice low but controlled despite the emotion evident in his rigid posture. "You've overstepped, Miss Morgan." I meant no disrespect, Abigail replied quietly. I lost someone too, my fiancé Richard in the war. Sometimes tending graves is all we have left. For a moment, Nathaniel seemed taken aback by her candor. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced briefly by something that might have been recognition, the shared understanding of grief. But he quickly shuttered his expression. Stay away from this place, he said, the command clear in his tone. Focus on your duties in the kitchen, nowhere else. He turned sharply and strode back toward the main house, leaving Abigail standing alone by the small grave. She looked down once more at the simple marker before whispering, I'm sorry, little one, and making her way back to the kitchen. The encounter left her shaken not so much by Nathaniel's anger, which she understood, but by the raw pain she had glimpsed beneath it. 5 years had passed since the child's death, according to the dates on the marker, yet the wound clearly remained fresh. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Nathaniel said little, responding to his brother's conversational gambits with single-word answers. Samuel maintained a steady stream of talk, seemingly determined to ignore the tension, while Catherine watched the brothers with quiet concern. Abigail served each course with professional efficiency, retreating to the kitchen between them to prepare the next. The food was met with appreciation, especially by Catherine, who declared the apple pie the best she had ever tasted. Even Nathaniel, despite his dark mood, ate with apparent enjoyment. After the meal, as Abigail cleared the dessert plates, Samuel approached her in the kitchen. My compliments to the chef, he said with a warm smile. You've brought something special to Thornfield Ranch, Miss Morgan. Thank you, Mr. Thornfield, Abigail replied, continuing her work. Samuel leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. My brother is difficult, but he was not always so. There was a time when Nathaniel was one of the most brilliant surgeons in Boston, with a thriving practice and a beautiful family. Abigail paused, her curiosity piqued despite her better judgment. What changed? Samuel's expression grew somber. A diphtheria outbreak 5 years ago took many lives in Boston. Nathaniel couldn't save everyone, including those closest to him. He shook his head sadly. He blamed himself, abandoned his practice, and retreated here to our family's old ranch. He hasn't practiced medicine since. I'm very sorry, Abigail said, genuinely moved by the tragedy. As am I, Samuel replied, but life must go on. Nathaniel refuses to see that, preferring to bury himself in this wilderness rather than rebuild his life. He straightened his tone, becoming more businesslike. In any case, I hope you'll stay on. The ranch needs someone like you, and perhaps you might bring some light back to this place. Before Abigail could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Samuel, dear, we should retire. It's been a long day. Samuel nodded, bidding Abigail good night as he joined his wife. Left alone in the kitchen, Abigail continued her work, her mind filled with thoughts of Nathaniel Thornfield, the doctor who could not save his family, the man who had retreated from the world to nurse his grief in solitude. Later that night, as the ranch settled into silence, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. The day's events played through her mind, the tense interactions between the brothers, the discovery of Sophia's grave, the glimpses into Nathaniel's past. Restless, she rose from her bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, intending to make herself a cup of tea in the kitchen. As she moved quietly through the darkened house, a faint sound caught her attention. The melancholy notes of a piano played softly but with evident skill. Following the music, she found herself outside a closed door in the main house, a room she had not yet entered during her duties. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a lullaby that spoke of love and loss in equal measure. Through the partially opened door, she glimpsed Nathaniel seated at a grand piano, his face transformed by the music he created. Gone was the stern, distant rancher, replaced by a man pouring his soul into each note. On the wall behind him hung a portrait of a beautiful young woman holding an infant, their faces illuminated by a shaft of moonlight through the window. Lydia and Sophia, preserved in oil and canvas, watching over Nathaniel as he played their lullaby. Abigail stood transfixed, understanding suddenly that she was witnessing something deeply private, a ritual of remembrance and mourning that was not meant for other eyes. Silently, she retreated, making her way back to her small room off the kitchen. Sleep eluded her as the lullaby's notes continued to echo in her mind. Nathaniel Thornfield was far more complex than she had initially believed. A doctor, a musician, a man whose gruff exterior concealed depths of feeling he allowed no one to see. The realization both intrigued and unsettled her, leaving her to wonder what other secrets Thornfield Ranch might hold. The next few days settled into a routine as Abigail proved her worth in the kitchen. Each meal was met with appreciation from the ranch hands, and even Nathaniel had begun to offer brief comments of approval. The one-week trial period no longer seemed as daunting as it had on that stormy first night. On the third morning, as Abigail reached for flour in the pantry, her hand brushed against a small jar pushed to the back of the shelf. It contained honey amber and thick with a handwritten label, "From Lydia's Bees, Summer 1872. Abigail hesitated, then carefully brought it out. The honey would be perfect for the biscuits, and using it felt somehow right. A small way to honor the woman whose absence still echoed through the ranch. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and biscuits as Abigail worked. She hummed softly to herself, the same lullaby she had heard Nathaniel playing the night before. The melody had stayed with her, haunting in its simple beauty. She was so absorbed in her cooking that she didn't notice Nathaniel's arrival until he spoke. "That song," he said from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. "Where did you learn it?" Abigail turned startled. I I heard it last night. I couldn't sleep and was walking to the kitchen when I heard the piano." She met his gaze steadily. "It's beautiful." Nathaniel stood very still, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Abigail thought he might order her to leave for this new invasion of his privacy. Instead, he simply said, "It was Lydia's favorite. She sang it to Sophia every night." The admission felt significant, a small confidence offered in place of the anger she had expected. Abigail nodded, accepting both the information and the implicit permission to continue using the melody. "I found this," she said, gesturing to the honey jar. "I thought it might be good with the biscuits, but if you'd prefer I not use it." Nathaniel approached, taking the jar from her hands. He studied the label, running a thumb over Lydia's handwriting. "She kept bees," he said softly, almost to himself. "Said they reminded her that even the smallest creatures have purpose." He handed the jar back to Abigail. "Use it. It shouldn't go to waste." Their fingers brushed as the jar passed between them, a fleeting contact that nevertheless sent an unexpected warmth through Abigail's hand. Nathaniel withdrew quickly, moving to pour himself coffee as if nothing had happened. "My brother and his wife will be leaving after breakfast," he informed her, his tone returning to its usual businesslike cadence. "They have a long journey back east." "So soon?" Abigail asked, surprised. "I thought they might stay longer." "Samuel has business to attend to," Nathaniel replied, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the hasty departure than professional obligations. "And Catherine. This lifestyle doesn't suit her. She belongs in drawing rooms, not on a ranch." There was no judgment in his statement, merely acceptance of the differences between his life and theirs. Abigail wondered if he sometimes missed the refinements of Boston society, the intellectual stimulation of medical practice, the comfort of city living. If he did, he gave no indication of it. "About yesterday," Abigail began carefully, "I truly am sorry for intruding on your private grief." Nathaniel studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You lost someone in the war," he said, not a question, but a statement, recalling her words from the day before. "Yes," she confirmed. "Richard, he was a lieutenant in the Union Army. We were to be married when he returned." "But he didn't return," Nathaniel finished for her. Abigail nodded, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. "He died at Cold Harbor. I was serving as a nurse just miles away, but I couldn't save him. By the time they brought him to the field hospital, it was too late." Understanding passed between them, the shared experience of helplessness in the face of death, of being trained to heal, yet unable to save those who mattered most. It created a momentary bridge across the careful distance Nathaniel maintained from everyone around him. The moment was broken by the arrival of Samuel and Catherine, dressed for travel. Breakfast proceeded with stilted conversations, Samuel making one last attempt to discuss the railroad proposition, while Nathaniel firmly changed the subject. Catherine engaged Abigail in polite talk about recipes and Eastern fashion, her kindness genuine despite the obvious tension between the brothers. As they prepared to depart, Catherine embraced Abigail warmly. "I'm so glad you've come to Thornfield Ranch," she said quietly. "Nathaniel he needs someone who understands loss without drowning in it." Before Abigail could respond to this unexpected confidence, Samuel approached to say his goodbyes. He shook her hand firmly, then leaned close to murmur, You should know, my father made Nathaniel promise on his deathbed to modernize this ranch to secure its future. That's why I pushed so hard about the railroad deal. It's not just about money." With that cryptic statement, he turned to his brother. The men exchanged stiff handshakes, their farewell lacking the warmth one might expect between siblings. As the wagon pulled away, Nathaniel stood on the porch watching until it disappeared from view. Abigail observed him from the kitchen doorway, noting the rigid set of his shoulders and the way his hand clenched at his sides. Whatever history lay between the brothers, it went deeper than disagreements about land and railroads. "Is there anything special you'd like for lunch?" she asked, offering a return to routine as a comfort. Nathaniel turned, seeming almost surprised to find her there. "No," he said after a moment. "Whatever you prepare will be fine." He hesitated, then added, "You've proven yourself capable, Miss Morgan. The position is yours if you want it." Relief washed over Abigail. She had secured her place at Thornfield Ranch and achieved the purpose that had brought her here. Yet Samuel's parting words lingered in her mind, raising new questions about the man who now employed her and the secrets that seemed to permeate every corner of this isolated ranch. "Thank you, Dr. Thornfield," she said simply. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." He nodded once, then strode toward the barn where the day's work awaited him. Abigail returned to the kitchen, her thoughts a tangle of curiosity and caution. She had earned her place, but she sensed that understanding Nathaniel Thornfield, the man behind the stern facade, would be a far more complex undertaking. As she worked, she found herself humming Lydia's lullaby once more, its gentle notes filling the kitchen like a benediction. Outside, spring sunlight gilded the distant hills, and for the first time since her arrival, Thornfield Ranch felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a place where she might someday belong. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as Abigail established herself at Thornfield Ranch. Each morning she rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Nathaniel and the ranch hands. The men had accepted her presence now, even showing appreciation for her cooking with small compliments and clean plates. Nathaniel remained reserved, but the sharp edges of his manner had softened slightly. He took his meals at the head of the table, occasionally joining in the quiet conversation, though more often listening in silence. Abigail noticed that he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with suspicion anymore, but with something more difficult to define. A week after her arrival, she decided to tackle the overgrown herb garden properly. She approached Nathaniel after breakfast, finding him on the porch reviewing ledgers. "Dr. Thornfield," she began, "I was wondering if I might have permission to restore the garden behind the kitchen. The herbs would be useful for cooking, and I noticed some lavender struggling to survive." Nathaniel looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. "The garden was Lydia's project," he said after a moment. "She brought the lavender from her family's home in Vermont. No one has tended it since." He didn't finish the sentence, but Abigail understood. No one had cared for it since Lydia's death. "I'd take good care of it," she promised, "and I'd preserve what she planted, especially the lavender." Nathaniel studied her face as if searching for something beyond her words. Finally, he nodded. "You have my permission. There are gardening tools in the shed." "Thank you," Abigail said, genuinely pleased. As she turned to go, he spoke again. "The lavender," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It was her favorite. The scent reminded her of home. Abigail nodded, touched by this small confidence. "My mother loves it too. She says it brings peace to troubled hearts." A shadow of something, memory perhaps, or regret passed across Nathaniel's face. "Lydia believed the same," he said quietly. The moment lingered between them, fragile as spun glass, before Nathaniel cleared his throat and returned his attention to his ledgers. Abigail retreated, but the brief exchange stayed with her as she gathered tools and began the task of reclaiming the garden from years of neglect. The work was satisfying, connecting her to the earth and to the woman who had planted these herbs years before. As she carefully cleared weeds from around the struggling lavender plants, Abigail felt a strange kinship with Lydia Thornfield, a woman she had never met, but whose presence still filled the ranch. The sun was high overhead when she became aware of being watched. Looking up, she found Nathaniel standing a few yards away, observing her progress. Unlike his angry approach when she had discovered Sophia's grave this time, his presence felt almost approving. "You've made good progress," he commented, surveying the half-cleared garden. Abigail sat back on her heels, wiping perspiration from her brow. "The soil is still good. With some care, everything should recover nicely." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze moving from the garden to the distant horizon. "It always amazed me," he said after a moment, "how resilient plants can be. Given the right conditions, they find a way to thrive again, even after severe neglect. The observations seemed to carry meaning beyond mere gardening, though whether he was speaking of the ranch himself or something else entirely, Abigail couldn't be sure. Nature is remarkably forgiving that way, she agreed, more so than people sometimes. Nathaniel's attention returned to her sharp and assessing. Is that what you believe, that forgiveness is harder for humans than for nature? The question seemed to hold personal significance for him, so Abigail considered her answer carefully. I think forgiveness is one of the most difficult things we're called to do, she said finally, especially forgiving ourselves. Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded once as if she had confirmed something he already knew. Don't overexert yourself in this heat, he said, returning to his practical demeanor. The garden has waited 5 years. It can wait another day if necessary. With that, he turned and walked back toward the main house, leaving Abigail to wonder at the layers of meaning in their exchange. She returned to her work, but with heightened awareness of the man whose grief seemed to permeate every corner of Thornfield Ranch. The garden became Abigail's refuge. In the following days, a place where she could work with her hands and clear her mind. Each evening after her kitchen duties were complete, she would spend an hour or two weeding, turning soil, and nurturing the herbs back to health. The lavender responded especially well to her care, putting forth new growth that promised future blooms. During her work in the garden, she uncovered a small wooden carving half buried in the soil near the lavender. It was a wheat sheaf, weathered but still recognizable, the craftsmanship evident in its intricate detail. Abigail cleaned the dirt from its crevices, wondering about its significance. When Nathaniel came to inspect her progress that evening, she showed him the carving. I found this near the lavender. It's beautiful work. Nathaniel took it from her, turning it over in his hands. His expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. I carved this for her, he said quietly, to mark the garden as hers. Lydia believed the wheat sheaf represented hope and harvest, that what we sow we eventually reap. He offered it back to Abigail, but she shook her head. It belongs in the garden with her lavender. Nathaniel nodded carefully, placing the wooden token among the reviving herbs. As he did so, Abigail couldn't help but feel she was witnessing a small act of healing, a reconnection to something precious that had been buried and forgotten. The moment was interrupted by Joseph the foreman approaching with urgent news. Miguel had been thrown from a horse while checking the north pasture fence and appeared to have broken his leg badly. Nathaniel's posture changed instantly, tension replacing the momentary peace. Bring him to the house, he instructed Joseph. Carefully, turning to Abigail, he added, I'll need hot water and clean cloths, and my medical bag. It's in my study's second shelf of the cabinet. Abigail nodded, hurrying to the house to prepare. She found the black leather bag where he had indicated, noting its well-maintained condition despite apparent years of disuse. Inside were surgical instruments neatly arranged and still gleaming, speaking of periodic care, even if they had not been used. By the time Miguel was brought in, carried between Joseph and Daniel, Abigail had the kitchen table cleared and covered with clean sheets. The Mexican ranch hand's face was gray with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Joseph explained that Miguel's horse had been spooked by a rattlesnake, throwing him against the rocky ground. Nathaniel entered, rolling up his sleeves, his manner completely transformed. Gone was the reserved rancher, replaced by a physician focused entirely on the task at hand. I need to examine the break, he said to Miguel, his voice calm and authoritative. This will hurt, but I need to understand what we're dealing with. As his hands moved over the injured leg with practiced precision, Abigail watched a different man emerge, one confident in his abilities, unburdened by the weight of grief that usually shadowed his movements. This was Dr. Thornfield, the surgeon who had once commanded respect in Boston's medical community. Compound fracture of the tibia, he diagnosed. The bone has broken through the skin. I need to clean the wound, realign the bone, and immobilize it. He looked up at Abigail. I'll need your assistance. You said you were a nurse. Yes, she confirmed. I've helped with similar injuries during the war. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze assessing her anew. Good. We'll need laudanum for the pain, alcohol for sterilization, and I'll require you to hold the leg steady while I set the bone. For the next hour, they worked together in focused silence, Nathaniel setting the bone with practiced skill, while Abigail provided steady assistance. Miguel drifted in and out of consciousness, the laudanum dulling the worst of his pain. As they finished bandaging the clean wound, Nathaniel sat back, exhaling slowly. The bone is set correctly, he said more to himself than to Abigail. If infection doesn't set in, he should heal well. Abigail began cleaning up the bloody cloths and used supplies, noting the distant look in Nathaniel's eyes. He seemed lost in thought, his hands automatically cleaning and repacking his instruments with the precision of long habit. "You're a good doctor," she said quietly. Nathaniel looked up, momentarily startled, as if he had forgotten she was there. "I was," he corrected. "Once." "You still are," Abigail countered gently. "Your hands remember even if you've tried to forget." A shadow crossed his face, pain mingled with something that might have been regret. "Some things can't be forgotten, no matter how hard we try." The words held layers of meaning beyond Miguel's treatment, touching on whatever darkness had driven Nathaniel from his profession. Before Abigail could respond, Joseph appeared in the doorway. "How's Miguel?" he asked, concern evident in his weathered face. "He'll recover," Nathaniel assured him. "The break was clean and we've set it properly. He'll need several weeks of rest, but there should be no lasting damage." Relief washed over Joseph's features. "That's good news. His family would have been beside themselves if anything happened to the boy." Nathaniel nodded, gathering his medical bag. "Abigail will show you how to change the bandages. Someone should stay with him tonight in case the pain worsens." "I'll sit with him," Joseph offered. "Not much sleep in these old bones anyway." Nathaniel accepted this with a nod, then turned to Abigail. "Thank you for your assistance. Your experience was valuable." The acknowledgement coming from a man who rarely offered praise warmed Abigail more than she expected. "I'm glad I could help." As Nathaniel left the room, she noticed that he walked differently. His shoulders straighter, his step more purposeful. For a few hours, he had been the man he was before tragedy struck him, and the transformation was remarkable. The incident with Miguel marked a subtle but significant shift at Thornfield Ranch. Word spread that Dr. Thornfield had successfully treated a compound fracture, and within days, a neighboring rancher arrived with his daughter who had a festering wound on her arm. Nathaniel initially seemed reluctant, but the child's obvious pain overcame his hesitation. Abigail assisted again, handing him instruments and providing comfort to the frightened girl, as Nathaniel drained the infection and cleaned the wound. His manner with the child was gentle but firm, explaining what he was doing in simple terms that eased her fear. After they had left with instructions for care and a small jar of salve, Nathaniel remained in the kitchen, staring out the window toward the distant mountains. "I had forgotten," he said quietly. "Forgotten what?" Abigail asked, wiping down the table. "The feeling of helping, of making a difference." He turned to face her, his expression unguarded for once. "I spent so long focusing on those I couldn't save that I forgot about those I could." The admission felt momentous, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. Abigail chose her words carefully. "Sometimes the hardest patients to treat are ourselves." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. "You're wise for someone so young, Miss Morgan." "Not wise," she corrected. "Just experienced in certain kinds of pain." Nathaniel nodded, the understanding between them deepening. From that day forward, his medical bag remained in the kitchen rather than hidden away in his study, a tacit acknowledgement that the doctor had not entirely abandoned his calling. Summer arrived in full force, bringing scorching heat to the Wyoming Territory. The work of the ranch continued despite the temperature, with the men rising before dawn to complete as much as possible before the worst of the day's heat descended. Abigail adjusted her routine accordingly, baking bread and preparing meals in the cool early morning hours, leaving simpler cold dishes for midday when the kitchen became unbearably hot. The herb garden flourished under her care, lavender now budding with the promise of purple blooms to come. She took pride in the transformation, seeing in the reviving plants a reflection of the subtle changes in Thornfield Ranch itself, a gradual return to life after long dormancy. Nathaniel, too, seemed to be thawing, if slowly. He spent more time in conversation with Abigail, asking about her experiences as a nurse, sharing occasional stories from his own medical practice. Though he never spoke directly of Lydia or Sophia, the rigid avoidance of their memory had softened. Twice more Abigail had heard the piano late at night, the haunting lullaby filling the dark hours with its bittersweet melody. It was during one such evening, as Abigail carefully watered the herbs in the cooler twilight hours, that disaster struck. The sound of galloping hooves and urgent shouts drew her attention to the eastern pasture where smoke was rising ominously against the sky. Nathaniel emerged from the barn, immediately grasping the situation. "Fire," he called to the nearby hands. "Eastern pasture. Get the water wagon." The next hours passed in frantic activity as everyone at Thornfield Ranch battled the wildfire that threatened to consume acres of valuable grazing land. Abigail joined the effort without hesitation, filling canteens for the men, soaking blankets to beat back flames, and helping to dig fire breaks alongside the ranch hands. Nathaniel was everywhere at once, directing efforts with the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis. His medical background served him well as he organized the men into efficient teams, anticipating the fire's movement and positioning resources where they would be most effective. By midnight, they had finally contained the blaze, though small pockets still smoldered across the blackened landscape. Exhausted ranch hands collapsed wherever they could find space, faces streaked with soot blisters forming on their hands from their efforts. Abigail worked tirelessly, bringing water to parched throats and tending to minor burns and injuries. Her nursing experience proved invaluable as she moved among the men, offering care and encouragement where needed. As dawn approached with the immediate danger past, she finally sought Nathaniel. She found him standing alone at the edge of the burned area, surveying the damage in the gray early light. His clothes were filthy, his face blackened with smoke, but he seemed uninjured. "Are you all right?" she asked, offering a canteen of fresh water. Nathaniel accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before answering. "Yes, tired but unharmed." He gestured toward the scorched earth. "We lost about 30 acres of grazing land, but no cattle, thankfully, and we stopped it before it reached the north woods." Abigail nodded, relief washing over her. The fire had been frightening, but they had faced it together and prevailed. "Everyone worked so hard," she observed. "The way you organized them, it was impressive." Nathaniel shrugged, though she could see he was pleased by her observation. Medical training teaches crisis management, triage, resource allocation, maintaining calm under pressure. The principles are the same, whether facing disease or disaster. "Doctor or rancher, you lead well," Abigail said simply. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully, really seeing her perhaps for the first time since the fire began. His expression softened with concern. "You're exhausted. You should rest." "As should you," she countered, noticing the weariness etched in his features. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We make a stubborn pair, don't we?" The casual observation, acknowledging them as a unit, a pair, warmed Abigail despite her exhaustion. "Yes," she agreed. "I suppose we do." They walked back toward the ranch house, together, the rising sun casting long shadows before them. The other men had already sought their beds, leaving the world quiet, save for their footsteps and the distant call of morning birds. At the kitchen door, Nathaniel paused, his hand lightly touching Abigail's arm. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you did tonight. Your courage and skill, they made a difference." The simple praise coming from a man who rarely offered compliments meant more to Abigail than elaborate thanks from anyone else might have. "You're welcome," she replied softly. For a moment they stood close in the early morning light, connected by shared experience and growing understanding. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on her face, his expression holding something Abigail hadn't seen there before, a warmth that went beyond gratitude or respect. Then with gentle hesitation, he reached up to brush a smudge of soot from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin, a heartbeat longer than necessary. The touch was feather-light, but charged with unspoken meaning, a boundary crossed that could not be uncrossed. "You should rest," he said again, his voice lower than before. "It's been a long night." Abigail nodded, unable to find words as Nathaniel's hand fell away. He stepped back, clearing his throat as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "I'll check on the men, then get some sleep myself," he said, his tone returning to its usual businesslike cadence. "We'll need to assess the damage properly once everyone's had some rest." With that, he turned and walked toward the bunkhouse, leaving Abigail standing in the doorway, her cheeks still warm from his touch. She watched him go, struck by the realization that something fundamental had changed between them, a shift as transformative in its way as the fire that had scarred the eastern pasture. Life at Thornfield Ranch took on new dimensions in the weeks that followed. The fire had created a sense of shared purpose, bonding those who had fought it together. Even old Fletcher, usually taciturn and solitary, had begun to share stories of the ranch's early days during evening meals, speaking of Nathaniel's father, and the challenges of establishing a foothold in the Wyoming Territory. Nathaniel himself continued to emerge from the shell of grief that had enclosed him for so long. He spent more time outdoors overseeing the recovery of the burned pasture land, but also taking time to observe Abigail's progress with the herb garden. Sometimes he would linger asking questions about the plants or sharing memories of Lydia's gardening methods. These conversations, though often brief, reveal glimpses of the man he had been before. Loss had reshaped him. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of blue, Abigail was working in the garden when Nathaniel joined her. He knelt beside her without a word, helping to weed around the now thriving lavender plants. "You've worked wonders here," he observed after some time. "Lydia would be pleased." Abigail smiled, brushing soil from her hands. The garden wanted to thrive. It just needed someone to clear the way. Nathaniel nodded, his fingers gently touching a lavender blossom. "Like many things," he said quietly, his gaze distant. They worked together in companionable silence as darkness gradually claimed the garden. Fireflies appeared, their gentle lights drifting like earthbound stars among the herbs and flowers. "I received a letter from Samuel today," Nathaniel said eventually. "Catherine is expecting their first child." "That's wonderful news," Abigail replied, genuinely pleased for the couple. Nathaniel nodded, though his expression remained pensive. "They want me to come to Boston for the birth. Samuel believes it would be healing for me to be there to use my medical knowledge for family again." The invitation clearly stirred complex emotions, and Nathaniel's hope mingled with fear, the possibility of redemption shadowed by painful memories. "What do you think?" Abigail asked gently. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his hands stilling among the plants. "I think he may be right," he admitted finally, "but the prospect is daunting." Abigail understood his hesitation. Returning to Boston would mean facing the life he had fled, confronting memories of Lydia and Sophia in the city where they had lived and died. "When is the baby due?" she asked. "November," Nathaniel replied, "nearly 5 months from now." Abigail nodded, giving him time to gather his thoughts. The fireflies continued their luminous dance around them, nature's gentle reminder that light persists even in darkness. "I think," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I would like to go to be there for Samuel and Catherine, and perhaps to make peace with what happened there." The admission seemed to cost him something, yet also to free him in some indefinable way. Abigail reached out impulsively, her hand covering his, where it rested among the lavender. "I think that's very brave," she said softly. Nathaniel looked down at their hands, then up to meet her gaze. In the fading light, his eyes held a warmth she had rarely seen, a glimpse of the man he had been before grief rewrote his story. "Brave," he echoed with a hint of dry humor, "or merely tired of running?" "Perhaps they're the same thing," Abigail suggested, "facing what frightens us most." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully, his hand turning beneath hers so that their palms met fingers, intertwining with gentle hesitation. The contact was brief but deliberate, a conscious crossing of boundaries that had defined their relationship until now. "It's growing dark," he observed, releasing her hand and rising to his feet. "We should go in." As they walked back to the house, Abigail was acutely aware of Nathaniel's presence beside her. Not just physically, but emotionally. Something had shifted between them in the twilight garden, a tentative step toward connection that both exhilarated and unsettled her. News traveled fast in the sparsely populated Wyoming Territory. Within a week of Miguel's treatment, visitors began to appear at Thornfield Ranch, seeking medical attention. A child with a high fever, a woman with a painful abscess, a rancher with a deep cut from fencing work, each came tentatively, having heard that Dr. Thornfield was practicing again. Nathaniel received them with initial reluctance that gradually gave way to quiet purpose. He converted a small outbuilding into a makeshift clinic, stocking it with supplies ordered from Cheyenne. Abigail assisted when needed, her nursing skills complementing his medical expertise in a partnership that grew more natural with each patient. One afternoon, an elderly man arrived leading a mule laden with mining equipment. His weathered face spoke of decades in the wilderness, his eyes rheumy with age but still sharp with intelligence. "Doc Thornfield," he said by way of greeting. "Name's Jenkins. Been working claims up north for 30 years. Got a cough that won't quit and figured it was time to see someone who knows what's what." As Nathaniel examined the old miner, Abigail prepared a tea with honey and herbs for the man's parched throat. She listened as Jenkins spoke of his solitary life in the mountains of the gold that always seemed just one more claim away, of the silent companionship of the wilderness. "You served in the war, didn't you, Doc?" Jenkins asked suddenly, his keen eyes studying Nathaniel. "5th Cavalry Medical Corps, if I recall correctly." Nathaniel's hands paused briefly in their examination. "Yes," he said shortly. "How did you know?" Jenkins smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Was at Cold Harbor. Got hit by shrapnel wound that wouldn't heal right. Young doctor with the 5th, saved my leg, maybe my life. Had your same way about him, quiet, thorough, steady hands. Remembered your name because he had a fancy Eastern sound to it." Abigail's heart quickened at the mention of Cold Harbor, the battle where Richard had died. She watched Nathaniel's face, but it revealed nothing beyond polite interest. "I treated many men at Cold Harbor," he said. "It was a bloody day." Jenkins nodded, his expression solemn. "That it was. Lost a lot of good men there." He coughed a deep, rattling sound that concerned Abigail. "Saw one young lieutenant get hit, bad stomach wound, the kind that doesn't leave much hope. Remember how hard that same doctor worked to save him even when it seemed hopeless." Abigail nearly dropped the cup she was holding. "This lieutenant," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Do you remember his name?" Jenkins squinted, searching his memory. "Been a long time, miss. Young fellow, well-spoken." "Think his name was Whitfield." "No, Wakefield. Lieutenant Richard Wakefield." "That sound familiar, Doc." Nathaniel's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes found Abigail's across the room. "Vaguely," he said. "As I mentioned, there were many casualties." The old miner continued, unaware of the impact his words were having. "Doc here did everything he could, worked on that boy for hours. When it was clear he wouldn't make it, he stayed with him till the end, made sure he wasn't alone. Always remembered that, how even in all that chaos he made time for one dying man's dignity." Tears burned behind Abigail's eyes, but she blinked them back, focusing on pouring the tea with steady hands. Richard. Her Richard. Nathaniel had been there, had tried to save him, had witnessed his final moments. After diagnosing Jenkins with bronchitis and providing medicine, Nathaniel walked the old miner to his mule. Abigail remained in the clinic, her mind reeling with the revelation. When Nathaniel returned, he found her standing by the window, her back to the door. "Abigail," he said softly. She turned, meeting his gaze. "You were there, with Richard. Why didn't you say anything when I told you about him?" Nathaniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man usually so contained. "I didn't remember, not specifically. There were so many wounded at Cold Harbor, so many dying men. I couldn't recall every face, every name." He moved closer, his expression somber. But hearing Jenkins speak of it, the details brought it back. "I do remember your Richard now. He was brave, stoic, despite the pain. He spoke of a nurse he was going to marry, of how she had inspired him to be a better man." Abigail's composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He talked about me." Nathaniel nodded, his voice gentle. "He did. He asked me to tell her to tell you that his last thoughts were of you, of the life you might have had." "But you never delivered that message." Abigail said, no accusation in her tone, only sadness. "I didn't know you then," Nathaniel explained. "In the chaos that followed, with more wounded arriving every hour. I'm sorry, Abigail. I failed in that duty." She shook her head, wiping away tears. "No, you were there for him when I couldn't be. That means more than you know." Hesitantly, Nathaniel reached out his hand, touching her shoulder in a tentative gesture of comfort. "He died peacefully, if that helps. The morphine took away the pain. His last words were of love." Abigail closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now. All these years she had imagined Richard's final moments tortured by the thought of him dying alone and in agony. To learn that he had been cared for, that his passing had been peaceful, lifted a weight she hadn't known she carried. Without thinking, she stepped forward into Nathaniel's embrace, her forehead resting against his chest as quiet sobs shook her frame. After a moment's hesitation, his arms encircled her, strong and steady, offering the comfort she needed. They stood like that, connected by shared memory and mutual loss, until Abigail's tears subsided. When she finally stepped back, wiping her eyes, Nathaniel's expression was unguarded, filled with a compassion that transformed his features. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being there for him and for telling me now." Nathaniel nodded, his hand briefly touching hers. "Some connections are beyond explanation," he said quietly. "Perhaps it's not coincidence that brought you to Thornfield Ranch." The thought lingered between them, and as they closed the clinic for the day, a new understanding binding them together. Not just their individual losses, but a shared past they hadn't known existed until now. July brought relentless heat, the sun beating down from a cloudless sky day after day. The burned pasture had begun to recover new grass, pushing through the blackened earth in a testament to nature's resilience. Abigail's herb garden flourished despite the temperature, the lavender now in full bloom, its purple flowers and soothing scent, a constant reminder of Thornfield Ranch's gradual renewal. One afternoon, as Abigail was preserving vegetables from the kitchen garden, Nathaniel entered with an unusual request. "There's a family 10 miles north who need medical attention," he explained. "Their youngest has a fever that won't break, and there are other children that are showing symptoms. I need to go there, possibly stay overnight." Abigail nodded, already thinking of what supplies he might need. "Of course, I'll pack food and medical necessities." "Actually," Nathaniel said, a hint of hesitation in his tone, "I was hoping you might accompany me. Your nursing experience would be valuable." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've come to rely on your assistance." The admission that he not only wanted but needed her help touched Abigail deeply. "I'd be happy to come," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the warmth spreading through her chest. They set out within the hour, traveling by wagon loaded with medical supplies, food, and necessities for an overnight stay. The journey took them through stunning country rolling hills, giving way to more rugged terrain as they approached the foothills of distant mountains. Nathaniel seemed more relaxed away from the ranch, sharing stories about the region's early settlement and pointing out landmarks with obvious affection for the land. Abigail listened attentively, enjoying this more open side of him that emerged when they were alone together. "My father brought me hunting in these hills when I was a boy," Nathaniel recalled as they passed a particularly beautiful valley. "He taught me to track, to read the land, to respect its power and beauty. Those lessons stayed with me even during my years in Boston." "You must have missed it," Abigail observed. "The openness, the freedom." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "More than I realized. When I returned after Lydia and Sophia," he hesitated, then continued, "I came seeking isolation, a place to bury my grief. But the land itself began to heal something in me even when I wasn't ready to be healed." The candid admission revealed how far Nathaniel had come from the closed-off man who had reluctantly hired her months before. Abigail smiled, touched by his willingness to share such personal reflections. "Some wounds need open air and sunlight," she suggested, "like plants that wither in darkness but flourish when brought into the light." Nathaniel glanced at her, a warmth in his eyes that had become increasingly common in recent weeks. "A gardener's wisdom," he acknowledged with the ghost of a smile. "Fitting given how you've revived Lydia's garden." They reached their destination by mid-afternoon, a small homestead nestled against the base of a rocky outcropping. The family situation was indeed serious, with 3 children showing signs of what Nathaniel quickly identified as scarlet fever. The youngest, barely 2 years old, was in the most critical condition, her small body burning with fever, despite her parents' desperate efforts to cool her. Nathaniel and Abigail worked side by side through the afternoon and into the night, battling to bring the children's fevers under control. Nathaniel's medical knowledge, combined with Abigail's practical nursing experience, created an effective team, each anticipating the other's needs with minimal communication. By dawn, the crisis had passed. The youngest child's fever had finally broken, and the older children were resting more comfortably. Nathaniel left detailed instructions with the grateful parents for continuing care, promising to return in a few days to check on their progress. As they prepared to depart, the mother, exhausted but deeply relieved, clasped Abigail's hands in her own. "God bless you both," she said fervently. "Dr. Thornfield has a gift, and so do you. Together, you're a blessing to this territory." The simple words, "Together you are a blessing," echoed in Abigail's mind as they began the journey back to Thornfield Ranch. There was truth in them she hadn't fully acknowledged before she and Nathaniel had indeed become a team, their individual strengths complementing each other in ways that benefited not just themselves but those around them. They traveled mostly in companionable silence, both tired from the night's efforts, yet satisfied with the results. When they stopped to rest the horses near a clear stream, Nathaniel surprised Abigail by addressing what the woman had said. "She was right, you know," he remarked, as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "We work well together. Your nursing skills complement my medical training in ways I wouldn't have anticipated." Abigail smiled, pleased by his acknowledgement. We balance each other, she agreed. Different experiences leading to a shared purpose. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully, his gaze distant. I've been thinking about Samuel's invitation going to Boston for the birth of his child. He hesitated, then continued. I've decided to accept, but I find myself wondering, would you consider accompanying me? The question caught Abigail completely by surprise. To Boston. Yes, Nathaniel confirmed as my assistant officially. The journey would take us away from the ranch for at least a month, possibly longer, depending on the timing of the birth and any complications. Abigail's mind raced with the implications of his request. Traveling to Boston with Nathaniel would mean leaving behind the safe boundaries of their professional relationship and at the ranch entering his former world as something between employee and companion. What about the ranch? She asked, buying time to process her thoughts. Joseph can manage in our absence, Nathaniel replied. He's done it before when I've had to travel. He paused, studying her expression. It's a significant request, I know. You should take time to consider it. But Abigail didn't need time. Despite the complications and uncertainties, she knew her answer immediately. I would be honored to accompany you, she said simply. Relief flickered across Nathaniel's features, followed by something warmer. Thank you, he said quietly. Your presence would make the journey easier. The admission cost him something Abigail knew, an acknowledgement of vulnerability from a man who had spent years building walls around his heart. That he was willing to make it spoke volumes about how far they had come together. As they continued their journey back to Thornfield Ranch, the Wyoming landscape stretching endlessly around them, Abigail felt a sense of anticipation building within her. The future that had seemed so uncertain when she first arrived at the ranch was taking shape in unexpected ways, offering possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Boston lay ahead with all its complications and connections to Nathaniel's past. But between now and then, stretched summer days at Thornfield, working side by side, continuing the gradual process of healing that had begun with a simple request to restore a neglected garden. Abigail glanced at Nathaniel's profile outlined against the vast sky and allowed herself to hope not just for his healing, but perhaps someday for something more between them than the careful partnership they had built thus far. As if sensing her thoughts, Nathaniel turned to meet her gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small but genuine smile that warmed his eyes and eased the lines of habitual tension from his face. In that moment, Abigail knew with certainty that whatever the future held, the journey itself would be worth every step. August descended upon Wyoming Territory with relentless heat. The sun burned in a cloudless sky day after day, the land growing parched as streams dwindled and ranch work became an exercise in endurance. At Thornfield Ranch, preparations for the journey to Boston occupied much of Abigail's thoughts. Nathaniel had written to Samuel, confirming their visit, and a reply had arrived expressing both surprise and pleasure at the news that Nathaniel would not be coming alone. The baby was expected in early November, which meant they would need to depart by mid-September to allow for the long journey east. Abigail found herself both excited and apprehensive about the prospect. Boston was a world away from the Wyoming frontier, a sophisticated city filled with Nathaniel's past, including memories of Lydia and the life they had built together. What place would she, a simple cook and former war nurse, find in such surroundings? These thoughts preoccupied her one morning as she kneaded bread dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary. She was so absorbed in her musings that she didn't hear Nathaniel enter the kitchen until he spoke. That dough may cry for mercy if you continue. He observed a hint of amusement in his tone. Abigail looked up startled, then smiled ruefully at the flattened mass before her. I suppose I was distracted. Nathaniel nodded, pouring himself coffee before leaning against the counter. He studied her for a moment, his gaze discerning. You're concerned about Boston. It wasn't a question, but a statement that revealed how well he had come to know her over the past months. Abigail considered deflecting, but chose honesty instead. Yes, she admitted, it's very different from anything I'm accustomed to. Nathaniel sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. It can be overwhelming, he acknowledged. The noise, the crowds, the social expectations. But it has its own beauty too. The common in autumn, the harbor at sunrise, bookshops and theaters, and music that can transport you. His voice held a warmth that suggested genuine affection for the city, despite the painful memories it surely contained for him. Abigail found herself curious about this aspect of Nathaniel. She had yet to discover the urban physician who had built a successful practice in one of America's great cities. You miss it sometimes, she observed. Nathaniel considered this, his gaze distant. Parts of it, he conceded. The intellectual stimulation, the medical advancements, the sense of being at the center of things rather than at the edge. He glanced around the kitchen with its simple furnishings and practical design. But I found value in simplicity too. Clarity, purpose without pretense. Abigail nodded, understanding. She had seen how the directness of ranch life had helped strip away the layers of guilt and grief that had initially consumed him, allowing the essential Nathaniel to gradually emerge. I've asked Joseph to accompany us as far as Cheyenne. Nathaniel continued, returning to practical matters. He has business there anyway and can bring back any supplies the ranch needs for winter. Old Fletcher will manage things here while we're gone. How long will we stay in Boston? Abigail asked, resuming her bread-making with gentler hands. Through the birth and perhaps a few weeks after to ensure mother and child are thriving, Nathaniel replied. Depending on weather, we might not return until spring. The prospect of such an extended absence from Thornfield Ranch gave Abigail pause. The ranch had become home in ways she hadn't anticipated when she first arrived, desperate for work and carrying her own unhealed wounds from the past. Nathaniel seemed to read her thoughts once again. You've put down roots here, he said quietly, made this place your own in many ways. As have you, Abigail replied, meeting his gaze, despite your initial intentions. A shadow of acknowledgement crossed his features. Yes, I came here to escape, to hide from life rather than live it. But somewhere along the way, he paused, searching for words. Somewhere along the way, healing began, Abigail finished for him, even when you weren't looking for it. Nathaniel nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small smile that transformed his features, softening the lines that grief had etched around his eyes and mouth. Even when I was actively resisting it, he amended wryly. The moment of shared understanding lingered between them, warm and comfortable. Then Nathaniel straightened, returning to his usual practical demeanor. I need to ride out to the north pasture, he said. Joseph reports the stream there is nearly dry. We may need to move the herd again before we leave. Abigail nodded, already planning the day's meals around his absence. Be careful in this heat, she cautioned. I'll have cold tea waiting when you return. Nathaniel paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her heartbeat quicken. I'll look forward to it, he said softly before disappearing into the blinding sunlight outside. Left alone in the kitchen, Abigail returned to her bread-making, her movements more measured now. The apprehension she had felt about Boston hadn't entirely disappeared, but Nathaniel's words had eased it somewhat. Whatever challenges the journey might bring, they would face them together, the doctor and the nurse, the rancher and the cook, two people who had found unexpected connection in a place neither had initially chosen. The weeks passed with increasing preparations for their journey. Nathaniel spent hours with Joseph and Fletcher, ensuring the ranch would run smoothly during their absence. Abigail preserved fruits and vegetables from the garden, organized household supplies, and made lists of necessities for their travels. Throughout these preparations, a new ease characterized their interactions. The barriers that had initially separated them, employer and employee, doctor and cook, widower and single woman, had gradually eroded, revealing a partnership based on mutual respect and deepening affection. One evening, a rider arrived at Thornfield Ranch bearing an unexpected letter. Abigail was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Nathaniel entered, his expression troubled as he held the envelope. It's from my mother, he said, confusion evident in his voice. Addressed to you. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron, equally puzzled. Your mother? But I've never met her. That's what perplexes me, Nathaniel replied, handing her the letter. She lives in Boston now with my aunt. I wrote to inform her of our visit, but I didn't expect her to contact you directly. Abigail opened the envelope with careful fingers, aware of Nathaniel watching her intently. The letter inside was written in an elegant, flowing hand. Dear Miss Morgan, you may be surprised to receive correspondence from someone you have never met, but I feel compelled to write after learning from my son that you will be accompanying him to Boston. Clara Morgan was my dear friend many years ago, before marriages and children led our lives in different directions. When I learned you were her daughter, I was overcome with emotion. Your mother once showed extraordinary kindness to me during a difficult time, a debt I have never been able to repay. I look forward to meeting you and expressing my gratitude in person. Perhaps through you I can finally honor the promise I made to your mother so many years ago. With warmest regards, Eleanor Thornfield. Abigail looked up from the letter, her mind racing. Your mother knew mine. My mother never mentioned any connection to your family. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. This is the first I've heard of it as well. My mother rarely speaks of her life before Boston. She mentions a promise to my mother, Abigail said, rereading the final paragraph. I wonder what that could be. My mother can be enigmatic, Nathaniel said with a sigh. I'm sure she'll explain when we arrive in Boston. Abigail carefully folded the letter, placing it back in its envelope. The mystery added another layer to their impending journey. Not just Nathaniel's past awaited them in Boston, but perhaps answers about her own family's history as well. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn touching the Wyoming landscape with gold and crimson. The wagon was loaded with their trunks and supplies for the journey to Cheyenne, where they would board the Transcontinental Railroad for the long trip east. Abigail felt a pang of melancholy as she bid farewell to the herb garden, now thriving under her care. The lavender stood tall, its bloom fading, but its scent still strong in the morning air. She knelt to touch the wooden wheat sheaf carving nestled among the plants, as a testament to both past and present, to what had been lost and what had been regained. When she turned, she found Nathaniel watching her from a few yards away, his expression soft in the early light. The garden will wait for your return, he said. Fletcher's wife has promised to tend it while we're gone. Abigail nodded, touched by his understanding of what the garden had come to mean to her. I'll miss it, she admitted. It's become more than just herbs for the kitchen. It's become a symbol, Nathaniel said, moving to stand beside her, of renewal, of possibilities. His gaze held hers, conveying unspoken meaning that made her breath catch. Like many things at Thornfield Ranch. They stood in silence for a moment, the morning breeze carrying the scent of sage and lavender around them. Then Joseph called from the front of the house, announcing that everything was ready for their departure. The journey to Cheyenne passed quickly, with Joseph providing lively conversation about his plans to purchase new breeding stock for the ranch. In the bustling railroad town, they bid him farewell with promises to send word of their safe arrival in Boston. For Abigail, who had never ventured beyond the Western Territories, the train journey was a revelation. Vast prairies giving way to the fertile farmlands of the Midwest, then the increasingly populated regions of the East Coast. Nathaniel proved an informative guide, his familiarity with the changing landscape providing context for the unfamiliar sights outside their window. As they traveled, the easy companionship they had developed at Thornfield Ranch deepened further. Away from their usual roles and responsibilities, they discovered new facets of each other, Nathaniel's dry wit emerging more frequently, Abigail's keen observations about the passing world revealing her natural intelligence and curiosity. They arrived in Boston on a rainy October afternoon, the city's brick buildings and narrow streets a stark contrast to the open spaces of Wyoming. A carriage met them at the station, sent by Samuel to convey them to his home in one of Boston's more fashionable neighborhoods. As they traveled through the busy streets, Abigail felt a flutter of nervousness. This was Nathaniel's world, sophisticated, urban, filled with memories of his previous life. How would she fit into it? How would Boston society view her presence in Nathaniel's life? Nathaniel seemed to sense her unease, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the carriage seat between them. Boston can be overwhelming at first, he said quietly, but you'll find your place here, just as you did at Thornfield. The simple reassurance steadied her, reminding Abigail that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. She squared her shoulders as the carriage pulled up before an elegant townhouse on Beacon Hill, its brick facade and white trim speaking of old Boston wealth and stability. Samuel and Catherine greeted them warmly on the steps, Catherine's advanced pregnancy evident beneath her fashionable dress. She embraced Abigail as if they were old friends rather than mere acquaintances. I'm so glad you've come, she said sincerely. Nathaniel speaks of you with such high regard in his letters, and I confess I'm grateful to have another woman in the house as my time approaches. The genuine welcome eased some of Abigail's anxiety. As they were shown to their respective rooms, Abigail to a comfortable guest chamber adjacent to Catherine's, Nathaniel to what had apparently been his old room. During previous visits, she began to feel that perhaps she might indeed find her place in this unfamiliar world. The following days brought a whirlwind of introductions and adjustments. Samuel had arranged a small dinner party to welcome them, inviting close friends and colleagues who had known Nathaniel during his Boston years. Abigail observed with interest how Nathaniel navigated these reunions cordial, but reserved accepting condolences for Lydia's loss with quiet dignity while deftly steering conversations toward current topics. She also noted how others regarded him with respect, certainly, but also with a certain curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the distinguished surgeon they had known with the weathered rancher who had returned among them. And there were questions about Abigail herself, mostly polite, but occasionally verging on impertinent, seeking to define her relationship to Nathaniel in terms Boston society could categorize and understand. Miss Morgan was a nurse during the war, Nathaniel explained at one such moment, his tone carrying a warning note that discouraged further prying. Her medical experience has been invaluable both at Thornfield Ranch and in treating patients throughout the territory. The explanation, while true, didn't fully capture the evolution of their relationship, but it served to establish Abigail as more than a mere servant or companion. She was grateful for Nathaniel's deft handling of potentially awkward social situations, though she couldn't help noticing that he never left her side during these gatherings, as if providing a buffer between her and any who might make her uncomfortable. One evening after a particularly lengthy dinner with Samuel's business associates, Nathaniel suggested they take a walk through the public garden despite the lateness of the hour. The night was clear, stars visible even through the city's glow, and the park was largely deserted. "You've been patient with all this socializing," Nathaniel observed as they strolled along a tree-lined path. "It can be exhausting, even for those born to it." Abigail smiled, appreciating his understanding. "Everyone has been kind," she said diplomatically. "But yes, it's quite different from our quiet evenings at Thornfield." Nathaniel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed across the lamplit gardens. "Boston has changed less than I expected," he remarked. "Or perhaps I've changed more." "How does it feel, being back?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious about his reaction to returning to the place he had fled after such devastating loss. Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Easier than I anticipated," he admitted. "There are memories, of course. Lydia and I walked these same paths and lived just streets away from Samuel's home. But they don't overwhelm me as I feared they might." "Because you've begun to heal," Abigail suggested gently. "Yes," Nathaniel agreed, his gaze shifting to her face. "Thanks in no small part to you." The simple acknowledgement warmed Abigail despite the cool evening air. They continued walking in companionable silence, their pace on hurried shoulders occasionally brushing in a contact that felt both casual and significant. "Samuel's colleagues seem impressed by your work in Wyoming," Abigail observed after a while. "Dr. Reynolds mentioned the hospital board would welcome your return to practice here." Nathaniel nodded, unsurprised by the information. "There have been overtures," he confirmed. "The medical community is small, and word travels. My assistance with difficult cases in the territory has apparently reached Eastern ears." "Are you considering it?" Abigail asked, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect of Nathaniel potentially returning to Boston permanently. He was silent for several steps, his expression thoughtful. "I've thought about it," he admitted finally. "There are advantages: better facilities, collaboration with colleagues, access to the latest medical advancements." "But," Abigail prompted, sensing his reservation. Nathaniel stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the soft glow of a nearby gas lamp. "But Thornfield Ranch has become home in ways I never expected when I retreated there 5 years ago," he said quietly. "Not just the land, but the purpose I found there, the life I've built." His gaze held hers, conveying unspoken meaning that made Abigail's breath catch. "The life we've built," he amended softly. The correction, that small, significant "we," acknowledged what had been growing between them more clearly than any declaration. Abigail felt warmth spreading through her chest despite the cool autumn air. "Yes," she agreed simply. "We have built something there, haven't we?" Nathaniel nodded, his expression softening in the lamplight. "Something unexpected but valuable," he confirmed. "Something I'm not ready to leave behind." Relief washed over Abigail at his words. She had feared that returning to Boston might reawaken Nathaniel's desire for his former life, making their shared existence at Thornfield Ranch seem primitive and limiting by comparison. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I've grown rather attached to our life there, too." Nathaniel smiled, the expression transforming his features in the gentle light. He offered his arm and Abigail took it, feeling the solid strength of him against her side as they resumed their walk through the quiet garden. No declarations had been made, no promises exchanged, yet Abigail felt as if something significant had been confirmed between them, a shared vision of the future that included both of them together in the life they had begun to build at Thornfield Ranch. The meeting with Eleanor Thornfield was arranged for tea at Samuel's home 3 days after their arrival in Boston. Abigail found herself unexpectedly nervous as she dressed for the occasion, choosing her best gown, a simple blue silk that Catherine had insisted on lending her, claiming it no longer fit her expanded figure. When she descended the stairs, she found Nathaniel waiting in the foyer, his expression warming as he caught sight of her. "You look lovely," he said simply, the sincerity in his voice making the compliment more meaningful than any elaborate praise. "Thank you," Abigail replied, smoothing the unfamiliar fabric. "I feel rather out of place in such finery." "Nonsense," Nathaniel countered. "You belong wherever you choose to be, Abigail." Before she could respond to this unexpected assertion, the front door opened to admit a distinguished older woman accompanied by Samuel. Eleanor Thornfield was tall and elegant, her silver hair arranged in a sophisticated style, her bearing regal despite her advanced years. Yet there was a warmth in her eyes, the same piercing blue as her son's, that immediately put Abigail at ease. "Miss Morgan," Eleanor said, moving forward with outstretched hands. "At last we meet. You have your mother's eyes." Abigail accepted the older woman's hands, finding them surprisingly strong despite their delicate appearance. "Mrs. Thornfield, it's a pleasure. Your letter was unexpected but most welcome." Eleanor's gaze moved between Abigail and Nathaniel, a knowing light in her eyes. "I see my son has found more than a cook and nurse at Thornfield Ranch," she observed with gentle directness. Nathaniel cleared his throat, a rare sign of discomfort. "Mother, perhaps we should move to the parlor for tea before you begin making assumptions." Eleanor laughed, a melodic sound that transformed her dignified countenance. "My dear Nathaniel, I've been making assumptions about you since you were in short pants. I don't intend to stop now that you've finally brought a woman home." The afternoon passed pleasantly with Eleanor, proving to be a charming and perceptive conversationalist. She shared stories of Nathaniel's childhood that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat, though Abigail noted the affection that tempered his embarrassment. Clearly, mother and son shared a strong bond, despite the physical distance that had separated them in recent years. As Catherine and Samuel excused themselves for Catherine's afternoon rest, Eleanor turned the conversation to more serious matters. "You must be wondering about my letter," she said to Abigail, "about my connection to your mother." "I confess I am curious," Abigail admitted. "My mother never mentioned knowing the Thornfield family." Eleanor nodded, her expression growing thoughtful. "Clara and I were girls together in Vermont before your father took her west and my late husband brought me to Boston. We were the closest of friends once." She paused, her gaze distant with memory. "When my first child was born, a daughter, before Nathaniel, Clara was with me. The birth was difficult, and both the baby and I nearly died." Abigail listened intently, sensing the importance of the story. Beside her, Nathaniel was equally attentive, clearly hearing this tale for the first time. "Clara had trained as a midwife, though she later became a nurse during the war," Eleanor continued. "She saved my life that night, though my daughter lived only a few hours. In my grief and gratitude, I made Clara a promise that if ever she or her children needed help, the Thornfield family would provide it without question or limit." Eleanor's gaze returned to Abigail, intense and direct. "When Samuel wrote that Clara's daughter had come to Thornfield Ranch, I knew the time had come to honor that promise. Though from what I observed, my son has already begun to do so in ways I never anticipated." Abigail felt a blush rising to her cheeks at the implication in Eleanor's words. "Your son has been a fair and generous employer," she said carefully. Eleanor smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. "Of course he has," she agreed with gentle irony. "And nothing more, I'm sure." Nathaniel cleared his throat again. "Mother, you're embarrassing Miss Morgan." "Am I?" Eleanor asked innocently. "I merely observe what is plainly before me, but I will desist for now." She turned back to Abigail. "My dear, I hope you will call on me again during your stay. I have letters from your mother that you might enjoy reading, a glimpse of her youth you may not have seen before." "I'd like that very much," Abigail replied sincerely. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor took Abigail's hands once more. "You have brought light back to my son's eyes," she said quietly. "For that alone, any debt to your mother is paid in full." Catherine's labor began unexpectedly in the middle of the night, nearly 2 weeks before her expected time. Abigail was awakened by a maid knocking urgently at her door, requesting her presence in Catherine's room immediately. She found the young woman, pale with pain, Samuel pacing anxiously beside the bed. Nathaniel was already there, his manner calm and professional as he examined Catherine. "The baby is coming early," he explained to Abigail. "I've sent for Dr. Reynolds as well, but given the rapidity of her contractions, I don't expect him to arrive in time." Abigail nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. "What do you need me to do?" "Help Catherine with her breathing while I prepare, then assist me with the delivery." The next hours passed in a blur of focused activity. Catherine's labor progressed rapidly, her pain intensifying with each contraction. Abigail stayed by her side, offering encouragement and support while Nathaniel monitored the baby's position and prepared for delivery. Samuel, initially determined to stay, had been sent to fetch more hot water, a task designed more to give him something useful to do than out of actual need. When he returned, his face was ashen with worry. "She'll be all right, won't she, Nathaniel?" he asked, his usual confidence completely absent. For a moment, something flickered in Nathaniel's eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "Catherine is young and strong," he said firmly, "and the baby, though early, appears to be in good position. We're going to take excellent care of them both." As another contraction seized Catherine, she cried out, clutching Abigail's hand with surprising strength. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Abigail assured her, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You're doing beautifully. Just a little longer now." Nathaniel positioned himself at the foot of the bed. "Catherine, I need you to push with the next contraction. The baby is ready to come." In the intensity of the moment, as Catherine gathered her strength for the final stage of labor, Nathaniel's gaze met Abigail's across the bed. Something passed between them, an understanding, a partnership deeper than words could express. They were in this together, using their combined skills to bring new life into the world. "I can see the head," Nathaniel announced minutes later. "One more push, Catherine." With a cry that seemed to come from her very soul, Catherine bore down. Abigail supported her shoulders while Samuel held her hand, his knuckles white with tension. Then suddenly it was over. A tiny, indignant wail filled the room as Nathaniel lifted a small, red-faced infant. "A boy," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A healthy boy." Abigail quickly moved to help cleaning the infant and wrapping him in the soft blanket they had prepared. When she placed the swaddled baby in Catherine's trembling arms, the look of wonder and love on the new mother's face brought tears to her eyes. Samuel bent over his wife and son, speechless with joy and relief. After ensuring that Catherine was stable and the afterbirth delivered properly, Nathaniel stepped back, giving the new family space for their first moments together. Abigail joined him near the window, both of them watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "Your calm was exactly what Catherine needed." "As was your expertise," she replied. "We do make a good team, don't we?" "The best." Nathaniel agreed, his hand finding hers in the shadows, fingers intertwining with natural ease. They stood like that, connected by touch and shared experience, until Samuel finally looked up, his face transformed by fatherhood. "Nathaniel, Abigail," he said, his voice breaking. "Come meet your nephew, Thomas Nathaniel Thornfield." Later that morning, as dawn light filtered through the bedroom curtains, Nathaniel and Abigail left the new family to rest, while they sought their own much-needed sleep. In the hallway outside Abigail's room, Nathaniel paused, his expression reflecting both exhaustion and deep satisfaction. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything tonight." "You don't need to thank me," Abigail replied. "I'm just glad we were here for them." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze searching her face. "When Catherine cried out like that, for a moment I was back there with Lydia, the night Sophia was born." The admission, offered without prompting, touched Abigail deeply. It was perhaps the most personal confidence he had ever shared with her. "Was it very difficult?" she asked gently. "The most terrifying night of my life," he admitted, "until it became the most joyful." A shadow crossed his face. "I never imagined then how brief that joy would be." Abigail reached out her hand, resting lightly on his arm. "But you remembered the joy tonight. You used your experience to help bring Samuel's son safely into the world." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed, his expression lightening. "Life continues, doesn't it? Despite our losses, despite our fears, new beginnings are always possible." The words hung between them, carrying meaning beyond Catherine's successful delivery. They stood in silence for a moment, the shared experience of the night creating an intimacy that transcended their usual careful boundaries. Then with gentle deliberation, Nathaniel leaned forward and pressed his lips to Abigail's forehead in a tender kiss. The contact was brief, but filled with meaning, gratitude, affection, and the promise of deeper feelings not yet fully expressed. "Sleep well, Abigail," he murmured as he straightened. "You too, Nathaniel," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As she finally entered her room and closed the door, Abigail pressed her fingers to the spot where Nathaniel's lips had touched her skin. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but it was a significant step beyond the careful friendship they had maintained until now. With the memory of that gentle kiss warming her heart, Abigail surrendered to exhaustion, dreaming of Wyoming skies, lavender gardens, and the promise of new beginnings. The birth of baby Thomas changed the atmosphere in the Boston townhouse. Joy permeated every corner, from the nursery, where the infant slept, to the study where Samuel worked with renewed purpose and energy. For Nathaniel and Abigail, the weeks following the birth brought both contentment and growing certainty about their shared future. Though they had planned to return to Wyoming shortly after the baby's arrival, Catherine's slow recovery and the onset of early winter storms in the West led them to extend their stay through Christmas. This unexpected extension of their visit allowed Nathaniel to accept several invitations from his former medical colleagues. He observed new surgical techniques at Massachusetts General Hospital, consulted on difficult cases, and even delivered a lecture on frontier medicine to an appreciative audience of medical students. Abigail accompanied him to many of these professional engagements, her nursing background and practical experience earning her respect in Boston's medical community. Together, they represented a unique partnership that bridged Eastern sophistication and Western practicality, formal training and battlefield experience. As Christmas approached, Boston transformed beneath a blanket of snow and festive decorations. The Thornfield home buzzed with preparations for the holiday and young Thomas's christening scheduled for Christmas Eve. One evening, as Abigail arranged pine boughs and red ribbons along the staircase banister, Nathaniel found her with an unexpected proposal. "I've been asked to consider a visiting professorship at Harvard Medical School," he said without preamble. 3 months next autumn teaching frontier medicine and surgical techniques in limited resource environments. Abigail paused in her decorating, studying his expression. "Are you considering it?" Nathaniel nodded, his gaze steady on her face. "Yes, but only if you would accompany me. We would return to Thornfield for the summer, come to Boston for the autumn term, then home again for winter." The proposal took Abigail by surprise, not just the professional opportunity, but Nathaniel's automatic inclusion of her in his plans. "You want me to come with you?" she asked, seeking confirmation of what his words implied. "I want us to come together." Nathaniel clarified, his voice gentle but certain, "As partners in this, as we've become partners in everything else." The distinction was significant, not Abigail accompanying Nathaniel as his assistant, but both of them embarking on a shared venture as equals. She felt warmth spreading through her chest at this evidence of how far they had come from their initial employer-employee relationship. "What about the ranch?" she asked, practical concerns surfacing despite her emotional response to his words. "Joseph manages well in our absence," Nathaniel replied, "and the visiting position would only be for one term each year if we find it suits us." Abigail considered the prospect, imagining a life that encompassed both worlds, the open spaces and honest work of Thornfield Ranch, and the intellectual stimulation and medical advancements of Boston. It was more than she had ever envisioned for herself, yet somehow felt right when considered as a shared future with Nathaniel. "I think it could work beautifully," she said finally, a smile spreading across her face. "The best of both worlds for both of us." Relief and pleasure transformed Nathaniel's expression. He took her hand, his touch warm and sure. "There's something else I want to discuss," he said, his tone more serious now. "Something I've been considering for some time." Abigail's heart quickened at his expression. "Yes." Nathaniel led her to a nearby window seat where they could sit facing each other in the warm glow of Christmas candles. He kept hold of her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her knuckles as he gathered his thoughts. "When Lydia died," he began carefully, "I believe certain chapters of my life were closed forever. I came to Thornfield, not to begin again, but to end quietly, to exist rather than truly live." Abigail nodded, understanding this all too well from her own experience after Richard's death. "Then you arrived. Nathaniel continued, his voice warming. With your strength and compassion, your willingness to see me as I am, while believing I could be more. You brought life back to Lydia's garden, to the ranch kitchen, to Sophia's memory. He paused, his gaze holding hers. And to me, Abigail. You brought life back to me. Emotion tightened Abigail's throat at his words, so honest and unguarded compared to the reserved man she had first met. You did the same for me, she replied softly. Helped me find purpose again and joy when I thought both were lost. Nathaniel nodded, acknowledging their parallel journeys toward healing. We've built something precious at Thornfield, he said, a partnership based on mutual respect and deepening affection. But I find myself wanting more, Abigail, hoping for more. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the candlelight with a warm glow. It was the wooden wheat sheaf carving Abigail had found in Lydia's garden months before, the symbol of harvest and hope that Lydia had cherished. Lydia believed this represented renewal and possibility. Nathaniel said, holding it between them, that even after the harshest winter, new growth would come. I think she was right, though not in ways I could have imagined when I carved this for her. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Abigail's. I'm not asking you to replace what I lost, Abigail. Lydia and Sophia will always be part of who I am, part of Thornfield's story, but I'm asking if you would consider building a new chapter with me as my wife, my partner in all things. The proposal, though not entirely unexpected given the direction of their relationship, still took Abigail's breath away. She looked at Nathaniel's face, seeing not just the man he was now, but all he had been: the grieving widower, the reluctant rancher, the rediscovered healer, and all he might yet become with her beside him. Yes, she said simply, her heart too full for elaborate words. Yes, Nathaniel, I would be honored to build that future with you. Joy transformed his features as he leaned forward to place the wooden carving in her palm, curling her fingers around it. This belongs to you now, he said softly, a symbol of what has grown between us and what may yet flourish. Then with gentle deliberation, he framed her face with his hands and kissed her, not on the forehead as before, but on the lips, a tender affirmation of the commitment they had just made to each other. When they finally parted, Abigail felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her. Not the erasure of past wounds, but their transformation into something new and beautiful, like the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold that Nathaniel had once described to her. What will Catherine say? She asked, suddenly aware of practical considerations beyond the perfect bubble of their shared moment. Nathaniel smiled, the expression lighting his eyes in a way Abigail had rarely seen. They'll be delighted, he assured her. Catherine has been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about what a fine addition you would make to the family. Abigail laughed, remembering Catherine's perceptive comments about their relationship. She sees clearly, she acknowledged, as does my mother, who warned me to be careful with my heart. But I think she'll be pleased to know it's in good hands. The best I can offer. Nathaniel promised, his expression growing serious once more. I cannot guarantee a perfect future, Abigail. There will be challenges at Thornfield, in Boston, wherever life takes us. But I can promise to face them with you, to build something worthy of the trust you've placed in me. That's all I ask, Abigail replied softly, that we face whatever comes together as partners, as equals. Nathaniel nodded, then drew her close again, sealing their agreement with another kiss that spoke of hope renewed and futures intertwined beneath the vast Wyoming sky that awaited their return. 3 days after Christmas, as Boston still lay blanketed in holiday snow, an urgent telegram arrived from Wyoming. Nathaniel read it with growing concern, his expression darkening with each line. What is it? Abigail asked, setting aside the book she had been reading. Typhoid fever in Pine Creek, he said grimly. Several deaths already, including Dr. Wilson. Your mother is helping with the sick, but they're overwhelmed. Abigail's heart clenched with fear for her mother. We have to go back. The passes will be snowed in, Nathaniel warned. Travel west is treacherous this time of year. Nevertheless, we must try, Abigail insisted. Those people need us. My mother needs us. Nathaniel nodded, already calculating their options. We can take the train as far as Cheyenne, then hire guides with sleds for the mountain crossing if necessary. Samuel entered the room, having overheard part of their conversation. What's happened? Nathaniel explained the situation briefly. Samuel's face grew serious as he listened. You'll need supplies, he said immediately. Medical equipment, medicines. I'll arrange everything. And I'll need to speak with Dr. Reynolds, Nathaniel added. This outbreak could be related to contaminated water. His research on waterborne disease might be crucial. The next 24 hours passed in a flurry of preparations. Catherine, though distressed at their imminent departure, helped Abigail pack, while the brothers gathered medical supplies and made travel arrangements. Eleanor arrived with additional medicines from her personal physician, along with warm clothing suitable for winter travel. On the morning of their departure, as the carriage waited in the street below, Samuel embraced his brother with unusual emotion. "I've only just got you back," he said. "Promise me you'll take care." "I promise," Nathaniel replied, returning the embrace. "We'll return in the spring with the professor's appointment settled." "No, see that you do," Samuel said gruffly. "My son needs to know his uncle and aunt." Catherine held baby Thomas as she bid them farewell, tears in her eyes despite her brave smile. "Go safely," she urged, "and return to us when you can." Eleanor's goodbye was characteristically direct. "You found each other," she said, embracing Abigail warmly. "Don't let anything, not disease, not distance, not doubt, separate you again." As their train pulled away from Boston, heading west into uncertainty, Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand close over hers on the seat between them. She looked up to find his gaze steady and determined. "Whatever awaits us in Wyoming," he said quietly, "we face it together." Abigail nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "Together," she agreed. Outside the window, the winter landscape rushed by the eastern cities, gradually giving way to the vast American heartland. Ahead lay challenge and danger, but also home Thornfield Ranch with its lavender garden and distant mountains, the place where healing had begun for both of them. As the train carried them westward, Abigail's hand remained in Nathaniel's. Their fingers intertwined, a physical manifestation of the bond they had forged, a promise of the future they would build together. In her pocket, the wooden wheat sheaf carving pressed against her heart, a talisman of renewal of harvest yet to come from seeds planted in sorrow, but tended with love. Outside, snow began to fall, transforming the landscape to a clean white expanse, a blank page upon which they would write their story together, honoring what had been while embracing all that might yet be.